Welcome to the Clutch Kitten Gaming Podcast, where I play an indie game for 5 hours and let you know whether or not it's worth your time and money. Hello and welcome everyone. This is James, also known as Clutch Kitten, and I am so excited that you're here for episode 41 of the show. Recently, my wife and I started the packing process for our move to a new place, and needless to say, I've learned that packing is really not that fun, and that makes limited gaming time even more difficult to deal with. Despite that being the case, I was still able to get game time in for this show, and I'm really glad I did because today's game was truly a joy to play. Before we get right into the review though, I need to mention a few quick things. First off, don't forget to smash that 5-star button on iTunes if you haven't already. It's super simple, and those reviews help push the show up in the rankings. Second, make sure you send me an email or DM with your questions, thoughts, dares, comments, or fleeting observations. It's a ton of fun for me to hear from you, and the best places to reach me are through my email at klutchkittengaming@gmail.com, that's clutch with a K, not a C, and on Instagram at klutchkittengaming. When it comes to news for this week, there has been a lot going on lately. Especially as E3 is not far off, tons of announcements and teases have been leaked, but we'll get into more of those once E3 actually hits. A two-headed piece of news that I wanted to discuss today, and that I found to be super interesting, was Microsoft's recent announcements about their games on PC. First off, they are working on bringing Game Pass to PC, which, if you haven't heard about Microsoft's Game Pass, that's their version of the game subscription model. You pay a monthly fee to get access to a bunch of games on the Xbox, and they're looking to bring that to PC. I believe details about price and all that sort of stuff are still to come, but it's a pretty exciting proposition as someone who is a PC gamer primarily. The second piece of Microsoft news is that they're planning to bring Xbox Game Studio games to stores outside of just the Microsoft Store on PC. Phil Spencer himself said, "Our intent is to make our Xbox Game Studio PC games available in multiple stores, including our own Microsoft Store on Windows, at their launch. We believe you should have the choice in where you buy your PC games." I'm super excited for both of these pieces of news. It's becoming more and more apparent that Microsoft wants their products spread out in the space, on the Switch, on other PC storefronts, and in the PS4 streaming technology. I also think that Phil's statement about choice in the PC storefront is very timely in a period where a lot of people are frustrated with Epic's exclusivity. Whatever side of the fence you land on with the whole Epic thing, I think that these pieces of news are just nothing but good news for those of us who game on the PC. Let's look now at this week's game. Today, we're going to be talking about Wandersong, which is an incredibly colorful, musical adventure game. It was released on September 27th of 2018 and is currently available on PC, Switch, and PS4. I'm not sure what the plans are for Xbox One, but as far as I can tell, it isn't currently on that platform. This game was developed by Greg Lobanov, who is based in Vancouver, BC, and although the game is primarily developed by Greg, he also brought in two other people, M. Halberstadt to work on the sound design, and Gordon McGlattery to compose some music. Greg has worked on a few other projects including Coin Crypt and Perfection. M came from working on Night in the Woods, which I'm sure you've heard about, and Gordon came from working on some titles like Rogue Legacy and Bunker Punks. One other interesting tidbit to mention is that Wandersong was heavily inspired by a bike trip that Greg took across America between October 2014 and March of 2015. I can definitely imagine that his experience inspired a lot of the characters that you meet in this game. Currently, Wandersong costs $19.99 and takes between 10 and 12 hours to beat. In terms of controls, I used the Switch Joy-Cons, and those were adequate for play. As we'll get into in a bit, I have some fundamental issues with the way the singing controls worked, but that really had nothing to do with the hardware that I used. Let's move on now to discuss the narrative. Music is what started this world. Aya sang the ground and plants and people into existence. She did a beautiful job. But now, the world has deteriorated. People have become corrupt. Darkness is crawling over the land. And Aya is preparing to sing a new song. One that will wipe out this world and reset existence. Although it's old hat for her, you really like how things are. Life isn't perfect, but doesn't a reset seem a bit extreme? There may be a way to stop the reset from happening, if only you can learn the Earth Song to preserve things how they are. Wandersong is set in a fictional universe where you play a lowly bard. Let's pause right here because that already starts things off in a weird way. You play a bard? I mean, if you're anything like me, bards, if they're even offered as a class in an RPG, they're the last thing that I usually pick. I would rather be a mage, or a warrior, or an assassin. Those are so cool. And bards are just kind of weird. Even in Skyrim, the last place I wanted to go was Bard's College. It's hard to want to go there when you have options like learning magic at the College of Winterhold, joining with the Thieves Guild, joining with the Dark Brotherhood. Those are way more awesome, right? Well, despite all of those things, this game does start you out as a lowly bard, and just like you and I are skeptical about playing a bard, the people in the world of Wandersong are skeptical about the bard himself. People see the writing on the wall. Their world is about to be destroyed, and the last thing they need is a bard. They need a hero. What's an annoying singer going to do to save the world? It turns out that it's finally your chance. Despite everyone's doubt, you know that singing is much more powerful than it appears, and you come to find out that if you can learn the mysterious melody, the Earth Song, you can preserve what's left of existence. That's what Wandersong is about. So how is the story? Despite it being unique that a musician is the main character, how strong is the narrative, and does it matter for the game overall? I'm happy to say that the story is one of the standout aspects of this game. There are a couple things that make the narrative truly great. First, the tone is so colorful and happy. The bard you play as has such a joyful presence, and even though the plot revolves around the world being wiped out, and one town you visit in particular is a pretty sad place, the overall tone is incredibly uplifting. It had a bit of that feeling you get from many kids' cartoons. Even though there are some dark themes thrown into the game, none of them are presented in too dark of a fashion. For example, a bully in one of the towns ties up your friends to rob them, but in the end, he turns out to be a sad puppy of a guy who just has some problems at home and is acting out as a result. You end up feeling bad for him instead of getting angry or scared. Another thing that made the narrative strong was the character development. This is an aspect that I'm sure was bolstered by Greg's bike trip across the US. The game introduces over 150 characters who each bring a unique look and perspective to the game. You're able to have brief conversations with most of the characters, and some of the individuals who are consistent throughout the story are fleshed out more and more as you play through the game. In terms of your character, the bard, he has almost a movie-like arc to his development. He is constantly bombarded by doubters, and he struggles with his own depression despite being an outwardly positive person and despite having success that no one before him had achieved. The writing in this game attained a wonderful balance of cleverness and silliness without relying on being overly crude or explicit. One example I have to bring up is the troupe of caffeine-addicted pirates. you end up traveling with a cheery group of pirates who are constantly drinking coffee, and it's hilarious. Not that all games need to be kid appropriate by any means, but having their drug of choice be coffee instead of rum changed the tone of those characters in a way that was still funny for me as an adult, while keeping the content appropriate for all ages. Although there are some aspects of the narrative which skirt around real life issues like death and corporatocracy and bullying, this isn't a game that sinks too deeply into those discussions. The overall story is encouraging, cheerful, and gives off all of the good vibes. Now that we know some about the narrative structure, what does the actual gameplay look like? What's interesting about this game is that the mechanics are not at all the main focus. In many ways, that's why Wandersong reminds me so much of Flipping Death. In both games, the reason you play is for the story and the characters. The mechanics are just supporting roles in the overall play. Despite that, we still should discuss the core system, singing. That is the primary way your character interacts with the world. It's a good thing too, otherwise you'd be a pretty shitty bard. At nearly all times, you can sing however you want. The right stick of your controller is literally just for making those musical tunes. Basically, you have a range of 8 notes, so an octave, and anytime you want to sing, you just press your analog stick in the direction of the tone you want to make. Beyond allowing you to make your own music for the game, singing helps you in a whole lot of ways. It steers a pirate ship, it calls birds, it soothes golems, it solves puzzles, it changes the color of flowers, it annoys people, and so on. Singing is your special tool to interact and progress through your adventure. There are even parts where you do a singing version of Guitar Hero. As much as I'd like to get into more details, I think we'll be better served discussing how it feels to actually play. To be completely honest with you, the systems in Wandersong were pretty mediocre. Singing was fun enough, but controlling it was often just a pain. Although the game was very forgiving in terms of hitting notes correctly, there was almost no good way to jump notes quickly without hitting some in between. That's basically just because using the analog stick is much less accurate and reliable when compared to using something like buttons. In terms of the platforming and puzzle design, they felt very hit and miss. Some of the larger puzzles where you have to recruit people for a band or recruit individuals to overthrow a corporation, those things were interesting and unique. However, many of the smaller puzzles felt tedious and annoying. Some of those puzzles almost felt like they were added because Greg wanted to give more gaminess to the game, but since they weren't that well designed, they just added unnecessary tedium and distracted from what made the game great. For example, on one island you have to figure out a musical code to open a door, and then you have to get another code to get the item you need. These were basically like those codes you have to do a million times in the Skyrim dungeons. You have to look around for clues and then put them together in the right order. Although conceptually it's not necessarily a bad puzzle style, the clues were much more obscure than I would have liked, and for me, that process really hurt the pacing of this game. As we're going through this, I am realizing that I'm being much more negative on the gameplay than I originally anticipated, but I think it's an important thing to highlight, especially in contrast to the great narrative structure. To conclude this section, I think we need to ask ourselves whether or not the gameplay ruins the adventure. Is it too annoying to overlook? I don't think so. Despite the mechanical play being mediocre overall, there were some very fun moments of gameplay, and despite some of the puzzles being annoying at times, the overall adventure really kept the flaws from being too obvious for most of the game. One really quick positive thing that I want to mention before we move on is the dancing. Dances are sort of a collectible you can obtain by meeting certain goals throughout the game, and they are a really cute touch. You can dance while you sing, dance while you talk, dance while you walk, and dance in pretty much every other situation you find yourself in. It has no impact on the actual gameplay, but it was such a fun touch that added another layer to the experience. Let's take a moment now to look at the art and sound design. Not only is the narrative colorful, but so are the visuals. From the singing, to the towns, to the animations, you're presented with a bright and whimsical game. The actual art was pretty cartoony and didn't have a ton of detail, but it fit well with the overall tone. In terms of the sound design, the soundtrack did a wonderful job of bringing depth and emotion to the game. I think it provided a much needed layer of quality to Wandersong, and the actual style of music ranged from quiet, serene tracks to big orchestral pieces. The sound effects were also really nice. It did take me some time to get used to that bard's somewhat dumb voice, but outside of that, it was awesome to see the amount of detail put into the audio for this game. One part that I thought was a really neat touch was when you go into a candy shop early on and the owner asks you to compose a jingle for the store. After you compose it, every time you go back into that store, your song is playing in the background. That's just one example of the creativity that was had with the sound design. Now that we've made it through the narrative, gameplay, art and sound design, let's summarize with some positives and negatives. First off, on the positive side, the overall spirit of the game was such a joy to participate in. Greg did such a great job of making you feel great while developing a super interesting world. Second, despite the downsides to the gameplay that we'll get into in a moment, I did appreciate how the singing and dancing mechanics played into the feel-good experience of the game. Third, the sound design did a wonderful job of smoothing out some of the game's rougher edges to present a well-rounded title. First off, on the negative side, the systems needed tuning. Although the singing mechanic was unique, the way it controlled was sloppy, and some of the puzzles just hurt the tempo and pacing of the overall experience. Second, although the colorful art was fun, there were times where it hurt readability in the game. I'm not a graphic designer, but in some of those moments where I was doing the Guitar Hero thing with the singing, the notes I had to sing were not very clear visually. We've made it now to the final boss. This is the part of the podcast where I tell you whether you should slay the game and buy it, flee the game and avoid it, or farm up and wait for a sale. My verdict for Wandersong is to slay this game. Despite some hiccups in the system application, I had a great time overall. Another awesome thing about this title is that it would be perfect to play with a kid. It's a positive and interesting experience that you can enjoy with the entire family. As always, thank you all so much for taking the time to listen in. I hope you enjoyed what you heard about Wandersong as much as I enjoyed playing it. If you found value in what you heard, I would love it if you told a friend about the show. I hope you have a wonderful rest of the day, and I'll see you in game.